Hello all. Have you ever asked me to do a video on installing Arch Linux dual booting with Arch Linux and Windows? So I chose Windows 7 for the example, and I'm going to use VirtualBox since I don't have a camera to record my screen. But I'll try to simulate this as much as possible. So this setup has one hard drive. Okay. I strongly recommend that you use a dedicated separate hard drive, but if you can't, I'll go through the steps of setting this up so you can dual boot. So we can also I can also call up a virtual machine to simulate a BIOS setup as well. So let's get started with that. Okay, I should also mention that this will be based on the BIOS, a legacy BIOS. The traditional BIOS, not the newest one, the proprietary, sort of proprietary bootloader. And that's what the viewer mentioned, is they're using legacy as well. So be aware of that. So the grub install is a lot simpler process for Arch Linux. So with that said, we'll click on the orb here, the start button, and we'll right click on computer. And we'll go to manage, and you wait for the program to load. Once it's loaded, go down to disk management and wait for it to find the hard drives or partitions. In this case, only one. This is the reserved. Don't touch that, please. And this is Windows installed. We can resize this. So we'll right click and shrink volume. Again, it'll check how much it can shrink by. Okay, so it says this part here: enter the amount of space to shrink in megabytes. Arch Linux can run on a few gigs, so I'm going to give it say 10. So it'll be 10, and then 1, 2, 3. So that'll be 10 gigabytes, and then shrink. And you'll see approximately 10 or 9 and change of unallocated disk space when it's done. There we go. So it says 9.77 according to Windows gigabyte unallocated. So we're done with that. So you just close the manager. The next thing is to insert your USB or CD-ROM of Arch Linux. And another suggestion is burn it to a CD-ROM if you're using Windows. USB gets a little tricky and it doesn't always work. So a CD-ROM on your actual machine, burn that image using that. And there's lots of free tools you can download. If you're a Windows 8 user, you can burn it right through the interface in Windows 8. But this is Windows 7. Okay, so just call up your disk and throw it in the machine, and we'll get to the BIOS screen and how to set that up. Okay, so this is probably a simpler BIOS, but they're all basically straightforward. So you have your main, and to navigate you use the arrow keys back and forth on your keyboard. So right here it has settings for boot, and in this case, it gives you instructions on the right. They usually do on how to manipulate. So if you wanted to boot from a removable device, such as a USB, that would be the first option at the top. It's highlighted. It's in white. If I want it for CD-ROM, I just press the plus sign, or if I want to bring that back down, I press the minus. And if I want hard drive, I press plus. Okay. And then when you're done with that, you press F10 and save and exit. Okay, so we'll set this up to boot from CD-ROM first. And press on this F10 to save and exit. And press yes. So you see here, it's booting right to Arch Linux disk. Alright, so that's basically what you would do in your BIOS to set that part up. I have the Arch Linux disks loaded up. There's something I want to go through first. Is I'm going to select reboot, and what comes up very quickly is a boot option in VirtualBox. So I'm going to reboot F12. That's how quick it went by. And on my system, that's the same key as F12, so it's you can select what you want to load. And here you can see it's detected one hard disk. There is no floppy. The CD-ROM, LAN, or continue booting. Now it's set, VirtualBox is set to boot from CD-ROM. So if I can check B or C. Now you might have something similar on your system. It could be a different key. Most likely it is F12. There might be like a key to boot to a disk or from an image or a CD-ROM or external drive. So I'm just going to press B to continue booting, and I'll just bring us to Arch Linux. And I'm using Arch Linux 64-bit. So I'll let this load up, and we'll continue. Okay, so here we are at the Arch Linux screen, and we're logged in automatically as root. It's a random password, I believe. So the first thing you do is we can do cf disk. Now you can just type that in without having to specify like device SDC or something, but it has to be a root, like the main hard drive. It can't be SDC1 or SDBA2 or 3. But in this case, we can just type fdisk and press enter. And you can see here, NTFS is the boot, which is the Windows reserved. Windows 7 SDA2, and then there's our free space we made, which is approximately 10 gigabytes. So down at the bottom here, it's highlighted as new, so you press new. Primary is fine because it's only one hard drive. If you have more than 4, I would suggest going logical, but in this case, it's just primary. And all of it. I'm not going to allocate a swap file. If you want, you can, but it's basically the same process. But I'm just going to leave it at 10 gigs and make that bootable as well. So you can see now there's 2 boot flags. And then we just go over to write and type YES. And then Q to quit. After that, it will make our file system on the device. So if you forgot what it was, you can just do an fdisk-L to list. And you can see SDA here at the top, the main drive. And this is the image, the CD-ROM, or whatever you're using. So SDA, SDA2, 1, 2, and 3. So we want to make a file system on SDA3. So it's mkfs dot. The popular one is extension 4. That's your best bet. And then /dev/SDA3. Okay? That's very important. So I press enter, and it will allocate 10 gigs of space. Now let's do that fdisk list. And now it says Linux, and it's bootable, and you can see the boot flag. So now we just mount it. Mount /dev/SDA3 2/MNT. You can do an ls/MNT, and you'll see lost and found in there. Okay, I hope that makes sense to you. It's just whatever you choose as the Linux partition, and what the name of the what it sees as the device. So the serial device is SDA3 in this case. All right, so I'll go ahead and download the Arch Linux packages, and then I'll start again when we get to the grub bootloading. So moving on, I've already ch-rooted into Arch Linux. I've downloaded some packages, and I set up my locale and system location time zone. So if you have wireless stuff, don't forget to get wireless tools, WPA supplicant, and dialog, so you can run Wi-Fi menu after you reboot. But in this case, we don't need that because it's a virtual machine. So the next thing is Pacman and -S, and I just type in grub because we don't need the extra grub unified, the extended unified firmware interface. Just grub. And if you're not sure, grub stands for Grand Unified Bootloader. Okay, and there's another tool we're going to get, but first of all, I'll just clear the screen, and we'll just do a grub. You start typing grub, press tab, and then install in and /dev sda. Remember that there's no 1 or 2 after that. Okay, so you press enter. It says i386 PC. Don't worry about that. It'll still be 64-bit if you're using. So no errors reported. Now we're going to grab OS Prober. So it's Pacman -S OS Prober. Okay. Enter. Enter. And you just run that OS Prober. Don't worry about the run via this thing. This is a thing that's looking at what we have mounted as the image. But it did find device SDA1 Windows 7, okay, which is what we want. So now we'll just generate our grub configuration. So grub -mk config -o /boot grub .cfg grub -mk config -o /boot /grub.cfg or configuration. Press enter. Again, you'll see that error about the virtual image, but it's found Windows 7 and of course Arch Linux. And that's it. We're done. So you just type in exit, and we just do umount or unmount /mnt. That's all we have is just /mount. And then reboot. I'm going to press F12, and let's go to hard drive. There we go. Now you see there's Arch Linux, Advanced Options, and Windows 7. So let's make sure Windows 7 is still there. So press enter, and we can see Windows 7 starting up, and the screen is much larger than I had hoped for, but it's there. Okay, so here we are, and you're back in Windows 7. It didn't run a check disk or anything, so I guess it's happy with what we did. You will notice that you have less hard drive space. You had 40 gigs before. Now we have 30 gigs because obviously minus 10 and change, whatever. And now we can eject that and make sure, hopefully that won't run at startup. Yeah, it's removed. Okay, so there's your Windows 7. Dual booting with Arch Linux, and just to double check, you'll see that the partition has changed. We go to Manage, wait for this to load. Okay, so now we have technically 3 partitions. The reserved, the Windows, and this is Linux here. See, it's this healthy, active primary partition. So it can't see it. You can get third-party tools such as Linux Disk Reader if you want to look at the partition, but you can't see it through traditional Explorer. So let's do a shutdown and restart, and hopefully the grub bootloader will kick in and we won't have to go to the CD-ROM. Okay, there we are. So Arch Linux. And make sure Arch Linux is installed, and device SDA3, and this is normal when you see all this stuff. Give it a second, type root and your password, and we're in. And fdisk -list again. You see we have the partitions, and there's lots of things you can do, like fdisk or how about disk free -H device SDA3. So it's using approximately 1 gig of disk space, and that'll get larger as the more you install an interface, and we have to get other stuff for Arch Linux to run. So I'm going to actually continue this a little more, and I'll install an interface. I'll use XFCE since it's pretty much the fastest and easiest to get through visually, that is. Okay, so I'll be back in a flash. So after a bit of time, I installed Arch Linux XFCE4, and you can see here that the Windows 7 partition is on the desktop. And I have another video on setting up NTFS permissions and how to allow you to read and write from it and to open the volume without being denied. So I have it set up for single click, but you can double click. There you go. There's your Windows 7 partition. You can look at if you can troubleshoot or whatever from here. You can delete files. I don't delete any Windows files, but in your user directory or something, or what's in public, if there's any junk in there, you can get rid of that. Like sample music if you don't want it, or sample. Just delete. Press Shift Delete, and it's gone. When you go into Windows, it won't be there anymore. But it's good if you have a virus and you might be able to track it down. You can remove a folder or a file that's there in your temp system, and so on. So Control Q to quit, and just if you don't want that, just eject volume. And you can also set up your file system table to have this mounted upon startup. Okay. So I'm going to go back into Windows, and we'll do another thing to wrap this up. Alright, so we're back in Windows, and we'll go to, where was that file? It was C users / was it public? Yeah. Remember we deleted the video, stuff in the video, pictures, music, you see that they're gone. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect Windows. You can do that. You can do that within Windows as well. Okay, so let's do something really mean. All the work I did. We'll go to Computer, Manage, and we're going to delete Linux. And the reason I'm doing this is to show you what happens when you do that. And this is why I suggest installing Linux on a different hard drive. A completely clean hard drive with nothing else on it, because this is what happens. So we'll delete the volume, say yes, and now let's resize to what it was. It'll go to the default 10 that we've specified, finish, and that's it. Okay, now let's restart the computer. Here we are. Welcome to Grub. There's nothing here. Error, no such partition. That's because we deleted it. So what do we have to do? Well, we have to load up our Windows 7 disk and boot. So machine, reset, and press any key. So just press enter to go into boot from your Windows 7 disk. Hopefully you have that. If you have an OEM machine, you might not. So you might want to do a backup or create a rescue disk from within Windows 7 so you can get your Windows installation back. This is one way of doing it, and it's not foolproof either, unfortunately. We're going to resize this a bit. Oh dear. Come on. Alright, go down here, hit next, and this one here, repair your computer. Searching for Windows installations. We can try the wizard, and it might take a while. That's probably not, we'll see what happens. Press next. Let's go to the command prompt, okay? and hopefully this will work for you. There's another option, but I can't remember. It's an NTFS something, but hopefully this works. Boot record / fix master boot record MBR. Probably it'll work because we're using a legacy BIOS grub, a legacy boot record. Maybe the extended one that won't work. So press enter, and same thing, and then replace fix boot, fix MBR with boot, fix boot. Enter, exit, and restart. You can just let that go. Don't press any keys. And there we go. We have Windows starting back up. So I hope that helps people out there, and especially the viewer that asks for this. I hope that it makes sense, and you can get on with dual booting your Windows. But I would strongly suggest a different hard drive if you can. And all you do is you point the bootloader, the grub loader, to that hard drive, which would be, for example, SDB instead of SDA, and it will ignore Windows. Don't run OS Prober, just ignore Windows. Don't even install OS Prober. Okay? I think that covers it. Okay, and yeah, I'll make some annotations and when I'm reviewing this video if I made any errors or whatever, or additions. I'll put some links as well. Explaining grub and Arch Linux and stuff. Okay, so that wraps this up, and everyone have a great day and a great evening and so on. And thank you for watching. We'll talk to you soon. Bye for now. Hello all. If you're asked me to do a video on installing Arch Linux, dual booting with Arch Linux and Windows. So I chose Windows 7 for the example, and I'm going to use VirtualBox since I don't have a camera to record my screen. But I'll try to simulate this as much as possible. So this setup has one hard drive. Okay, I strongly recommend that you use dedicated separate hard drive. So we'll right click and shrink volume. Again, it'll check how much it can shrink by. Okay, so it says this part here, enter the amount of space to shrink in megabytes. Arch Linux can run on a few gigs. So I'm going to give it say 10, so it'll be 10 and then 1, 2, 3. So that'll be 10 gigabytes and then shrink. And you'll see approximately 10 or 9 and change of unallocated disk space when it's done. It was a lot simpler process for Arch Linux. So with that said, we'll click on the orb here, the start button, and we'll right click on computer, and we'll go to manage, and you wait for the program to load. Once it's loaded, go down to disk management and wait for it to find the hard drives or partitions. In this case, only one. This is reserved. Don't touch that, please. And this is Windows installed. We can resize this, but if you can't, I'll go through the steps of setting this up so you can dual boot. So we can also I can also call up a virtual machine to simulate a BIOS setup as well. So let's get started with that. Okay, I should also mention that this will be based on the BIOS, a legacy BIOS, the traditional BIOS, not the newest one, the proprietary, well, sort of proprietary bootloader. And that's what the viewer mentioned, is they're using legacy as well. So be aware of that. So the grub install, there we go. So it says 9.77 according to Windows, gigabyte unallocated. So we're done with that. So you just close the manager. The next thing is to insert your USB or CD-ROM of Arch Linux. And another suggestion is burn it to a CD-ROM if you're using Windows. USB gets a little tricky and it doesn't always work. So a CD-ROM on your actual machine, burn that image using that. And there's lots of free tools you can download. If you're a Windows 8 user, you can burn it right through the interface.